Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The McGurk effect. Why seeing changes what you hear. A person watches a video of someone speaking, sees their lips move, hears sounds, and perceives speech, but something strange occurs. The auditory signal says one thing, the syllable bah, and the visual signal shows lips making a different movement, the movement for ga, and yet what the person hears is neither ba nor ga, but da, a fusion of the two inputs, a compromise between hearing and vision. And this is the McGurk effect, discovered by psychologist Harry McGurk in 1976. A robust illusion showing that speech perception is multimodal, integrates auditory and visual information. And vision can alter what you hear, can change the perceived phoneme, even though the auditory input remains constant and the effect is automatic, is unconscious, occurs even when you know it is happening, and closing your eyes restores the original bar sound, showing that vision was modifying auditory perception, and the McGurk effect reveals that perception is not modality specific, but is multimodal, that different senses interact, that seeing influences hearing and hearing influences seeing, and perception is a unified process that integrates information from multiple sources. And this has implications for theories of perception, for understanding consciousness, and for recognizing that sensory modalities are not separate channels, but are interconnected systems that jointly construct perceptual experience. Imagine experiencing the effect, watching a video where someone's lips move saying ga while the audio plays ba, and you hear da, not what was said, not what the lips showed, but a fusion. And you know the audio is ba, can check by closing your eyes, but when your eyes are open, you hear da, vision overrides audition, changes what you hear, and the effect is involuntary, is not something you can turn off. Perception integrates the inputs automatically, and this integration occurs before consciousness, before you become aware of the sound, and what reaches awareness is already a fusion, already combines hearing and seeing, and you cannot access the separate inputs, cannot hear bay and see gay separately, but only experience the integrated da. The McGurk effect demonstrates that speech perception is not purely auditory, not simply a matter of processing sound waves, but involves visual information about lip movements, facial gestures, speaker identity, and context. And the brain combines these sources, weighs them according to reliability, and produces a unified percept. And when visual and auditory information conflict, the brain compromises, produces a perception that splits the difference. And this compromise shows that perception is not just input-driven but is constructed, is the result of unconscious inference, of combining cues according to probabilities. And McGurk is an example where the inference goes wrong, produces a percept that does not match either input perfectly, but represents the brain's best guess given conflicting information. Visualize the perceptual system as Bayesian, as computing probabilities based on sensory inputs and prior expectations. And when you see lips saying gya and hear br, the brain computes that die is most likely given that visual and auditory cues are both somewhat unreliable and the percept should compromise between them. And this Bayesian integration explains many perceptual phenomena, explains how the brain combines cues from different senses, weights them by reliability, and produces unified, coherent experience. And the McGurk effect is a case where the integration produces an incorrect result, but reveals the normal processing that usually works well, that usually integrates senses accurately. The McGurk effect challenges theories that treat senses as separate, that analyze vision separately from audition, that assume perception is modality specific, and the effect shows that modalities interact. That perception is fundamentally multimodal, and this has led to theories of multisensory integration, to research on how the brain combines information from different senses, where in the brain this integration occurs, and what rules govern it. And the McGurk effect has become a paradigm case, a standard demonstration of multimodal perception used in countless psychology classes and research studies. The effect also has implications for understanding consciousness, because the fusion occurs before consciousness, occurs in processing that we do not have access to, and what we experience as the result of this processing is the fused percept, and we do not experience the separate auditory and visual inputs, do not have access to the processing that combined them, and consciousness receives only the output, only the unified percept, and this shows that much of perception is unconscious, is hidden from awareness, and conscious experience is constructed from unconscious processing, and the construction is so seamless that we do not notice it, do not realize that our experience is a synthesis rather than a direct recording of input. The McGurk effect appears in discussions of cognitive penetrability, because if perception is modular, if sensory systems are encapsulated, then one modality should not influence another. Vision should not alter what you hear, but the McGurk effect shows cross-modal influence, shows that perception is not strictly modular, that different sensory modules communicate and interact. And this qualifies strong modularity, suggests that while early sensory processing may be modular, later perceptual processing integrates across modalities, and perception as a whole is not modular but is interactive. And the McGurk effect is evidence for this interactivity, for perceptual systems that are not strictly separated but are interconnected. The effect also has practical implications for understanding speech perception in noisy environments, for designing hearing aids that take advantage of visual information, for developing virtual reality systems that create convincing multimodal experiences, and for understanding how perception can be manipulated, how illusions can be created through conflicting sensory cues. And the McGurk effect shows that perception is vulnerable to these manipulations, is not simply determined by physical input, but depends on how inputs are integrated. The person watches the video, hears da, knows the audio says ba, sees the lips say ga, and yet perceives da, a fusion that is none of the inputs but is the brain's compromise. And the McGurk effect persists, demonstrates multimodal integration, challenges modular theories, reveals unconscious perceptual processing, and stands as one of the most famous demonstrations in cognitive psychology. A simple effect that reveals deep truths about how perception works, how senses interact, how consciousness is constructed from unconscious processes, and the effect remains robust and automatic, a permanent feature of human speech perception, showing that seeing changes, hearing, that perception is unified, that the brain constructs experience from multiple sources, and the fusion continues. Da heard when ba was spoken, and ga was seen, and the McGurk effect endures. The manipulation argument, when being programmed feels like choosing. A scientist creates a person in a laboratory, designs their brain molecule by molecule, programs their psychology precisely, installs specific beliefs, desires, values, personality traits, and then releases this person into the world, and the person deliberates about what to do, weighs options, considers consequences, makes decisions based on their reasons, their desires, their values, and all of this psychological processing feels normal from the inside, feels like genuine deliberation, genuine choice, and yet the person's entire psychology was determined by the scientist, was programmed. And so the person's choices are not really their own, not really free, are the scientist's choices implemented through the person's brain, and the person is not responsible for actions that flow from programmed psychology, is more like a puppet than an agent. And this is the manipulation argument against compatibilism. The argument that being determined by natural causes, by genes and environment, is relevantly similar to being determined by manipulation, by programming. And if programmed persons lack free will, then naturally determined persons also lack free will. And since determinism says all persons are naturally determined, all persons lack free will if determinism is true, and compatibilism is false. And this manipulation argument, developed by Dirk Peerboom and others, creates a serious challenge for compatibilist theories. Forces compatibilists to explain how natural determination differs from manipulation, how being caused by evolution and upbringing differs from being caused by a neuroscientist. And the argument remains controversial, remains debated, and compatibilists offer various responses. But the challenge persists. Imagine the manipulated person situation. They wake up in the laboratory, memories implanted, personality formed, and they go about their life, make choices, pursue goals, and from their perspective, everything seems normal. They feel like they are choosing freely, feel like their decisions are their own, and yet every thought, every desire, every value was installed by the scientist. And nothing about their psychology is random. Nothing escaped the scientist's control. And now consider whether this person is morally responsible for their actions, whether they deserve praise or blame. And the intuition is no. They are not responsible because their actions flow from programmed psychology, from values and desires they did not choose, that were imposed on them. And responsibility requires that psychology be one's own, not be externally determined. And the manipulated person's psychology is not their own, is the scientist's creation. And so they lack responsibility, lack free will. The manipulation argument proceeds through cases, starts with extreme manipulation, obvious programming, and then gradually moves toward more natural cases, and asks at each stage whether the person is responsible, and the cases are designed to show that there is no relevant difference between manipulation and natural causation, that if manipulation undermines responsibility, then natural determination also undermines responsibility. And the four-case argument, Peerboom's version, goes as follows. In case 1, a person is directly manipulated by scientists who induce specific mental states. In case 2, a person is programmed from birth by scientists who arrange their environment and training. In case 3, a person is determined by their genetic, inheritance, and upbringing without any intentional manipulation. In case 4, a person is determined by the normal causal processes of a deterministic universe. And Peerboom argues that there is no morally relevant difference between these cases, that if case 1 undermines responsibility, then so do the others. And since case 4 is just determinism, determinism undermines responsibility, and compatibilism is false. Visualize the progression, from direct neural manipulation to genetic engineering to natural upbringing to deterministic causation. And at each stage, the person's psychology is caused by factors beyond their control, factors they did not choose. And the manipulation argument says that the source of causation, whether intentional or natural, does not matter for responsibility. What matters is that the person's psychology was determined by factors beyond their control. And this determination undermines freedom regardless of whether a scientist or nature did the determining. And if we agree that the manipulated person, in case 1, is not responsible, then we must agree that naturally determined persons, in case 4, are also not responsible, and compatibilism, which says determinism is compatible with responsibility, is refuted. Compatibilists respond to the manipulation argument with various strategies. One response distinguishes between manipulation and natural determination, argues that manipulation involves bypassing the person's normal, deliberative processes, involves imposing psychology externally, while natural determination involves the person's psychology developing through normal processes, through learning and experience and interaction with the world. And this difference matters for responsibility, makes naturally determined persons responsible, even though manipulated persons are not. And the manipulation argument fails because it ignores this difference, treats all determination as equivalent when it is not. Another compatibilist response argues that the manipulated person is responsible, challenges the intuition that manipulation undermines responsibility, and this response requires biting the bullet, accepting that even persons whose psychology was programmed by scientists are responsible as long as their actions flow from their own deliberation, their own reasons, even if those reasons were installed. And this response preserves compatibilism by denying that manipulation undermines responsibility, by insisting that what matters for responsibility is not the origin of psychology, but its current functional organization. And if the person deliberates and acts on their deliberations, then they are responsible, regardless of how their psychology came to be. A third compatibilist response distinguishes between historical and structural accounts of responsibility, argues that responsibility depends on the structure of the person's psychology, on whether they have the right kind of control mechanisms, the right kind of reflective capacities, not on the history of how that psychology was formed and manipulated. Persons can have the right structure, even if their history is abnormal, and so they are responsible. And the manipulation argument fails because it assumes that history matters when only structure matters, and compatibilism is preserved by adopting a structural rather than historical account of responsibility. Incompatibilists defend the manipulation argument, defend the intuition that manipulation undermines responsibility, and argue that compatibilist responses are ad hoc, are motivated by a desire to save compatibilism rather than by principled distinctions, and there is no relevant difference between being determined by a scientist and being determined by genes and environment. Both involve the person's psychology being shaped by factors beyond their control. Both undermine the kind of control required for responsibility, and the manipulation argument succeeds in showing that compatibilism is false, that determination, whether by manipulation or by nature, is inconsistent with freedom. The manipulation argument also raises questions about what responsibility requires, about whether responsibility is historical, depends on how psychology was formed, or structural, depends only on current organization, and this debate is central to understanding free will, to clarifying what kind of control is required for moral responsibility, and the manipulation argument forces this debate into the open, makes it explicit. And even if the argument does not definitively refute compatibilism, it succeeds in challenging compatibilists to articulate their view clearly, to explain what distinguishes responsible from non-responsible agents. The programmed person walks through life, choosing, deliberating, acting, and feeling free. And the question remains whether they are genuinely responsible, whether their choices are truly their own, or whether they are puppets, implementations of the scientist's design. And the manipulation argument uses this person to challenge compatibilism, to question whether natural determination is really different from artificial manipulation, and the argument persists as one of the most powerful challenges to compatibilist theories. A challenge that highlights the difference between feeling free and being free, between subjective experience of choice and objective reality of determination. And the manipulated person remains choosing but programmed, free-feeling but determined. And whether such a person is responsible remains contested. And the manipulation argument endures as a permanent challenge to compatibilism, forcing recognition that if determinism is true, then we are all in a sense manipulated, determined by factors beyond our control. And whether this determination undermines responsibility, whether it makes us unfree, remains one of the deepest questions in philosophy of free will. The liberal paradox, when freedom and choice destroy each other. An economist named Amartya Sen constructs a paradox about individual liberty and social choice, about whether societies can simultaneously respect individual freedom and satisfy basic welfare criteria. And the paradox goes as follows. Suppose society values individual freedom, values the principle that each person should be decisive over certain personal matters, should have sovereignty over a domain of choices, perhaps what to wear or what to read or how to live, and call this principle minimal liberalism, the requirement that each individual has at least one pair of alternatives where their preference determines social choice. And now suppose society also values Pareto efficiency, values the principle that if everyone prefers outcome A to outcome B, then society should choose A, should not choose an outcome that makes everyone worse off. And Sen proves that these two principles are incompatible, that no social decision procedure can guarantee both minimal liberalism and Pareto efficiency, that respecting individual freedom can conflict with respecting unanimous preferences. And this is the liberal paradox, also called the impossibility of a Paretian liberal, a demonstration that liberal values contain internal tensions, that freedom and welfare can conflict, that respecting individual choice over personal matters can lead to outcomes that everyone prefers to avoid. And the paradox has generated enormous literature, has sparked debates about the nature of rights, about whether rights are absolute or can be traded, about how to resolve conflicts between liberty and welfare, and the liberal paradox remains one of the most important results in social choice theory, remains a challenge to liberal political philosophy. Imagine a specific example. Two people, call them Prude and Lewd, and a book, and Prude prefers that no one read the book, finds it offensive, would be most satisfied if neither reads it. And second best for Prude is if Prude reads it rather than Lewd reading it, because at least then Prude can argue against it from first-hand knowledge, and worst for Prude is if Lewd reads it while Prude does not. And Lewd has opposite preferences, most prefers that Prude read the book, because Lewd thinks Prude needs liberalising. Second best for Lewd is that Lewd reads it, and worst is that neither reads it. And now apply minimal liberalism. Say that Prude should be decisive over whether Prude reads the book, should have the right to choose for themselves, and Lewd should be decisive over whether Lewd reads the book, and Prude chooses not to read, exercises their right, and Lewd chooses to read, exercises their right, and the outcome is Prude does not read and Lewd reads, but both prefer the outcome where Prude reads and Lewd does not. Both rank that outcome higher, and so the liberal outcome, the outcome that respects individual rights, violates Pareto efficiency, produces an outcome that both prefer to avoid, and the paradox emerges, respecting rights produces an outcome that unanimous preferences reject. The liberal paradox demonstrates that rights and welfare can conflict, that giving individuals control over personal matters can lead to collectively worse outcomes. And this challenges the assumption that liberalism is coherent, that respecting freedom always improves welfare, and Sen's paradox shows that this is false, shows that freedom and welfare can diverge, that societies face trade-offs between respecting rights and respecting preferences, and different resolutions prioritize differently. Some prioritize rights and accept that Pareto improvements may be blocked, accept that unanimous preferences may be overridden by individual sovereignty, and other resolutions prioritize welfare and accept that rights may be violated when everyone would benefit, and neither resolution is fully satisfying. Both involve accepting tensions within liberal values. Visualize the paradox as revealing a cycle. Individual rights produce an outcome, unanimous preferences reject that outcome and prefer an alternative, but that alternative violates individual rights, and we are stuck, cannot satisfy both rights and preferences simultaneously. And this cycle shows that liberalism contains contradictions, that its commitments can conflict, and resolving the conflict requires prioritizing, requires deciding whether rights or welfare is more fundamental, and different liberal theories answer differently. Rights-based liberalism prioritizes rights and accepts welfare losses. Welfare-based liberalism prioritizes welfare and accepts rights violations, and no theory satisfies both perfectly. One response to the liberal paradox argues that the problem is with the specification of rights, that the rights in Sen's example are meddlesome, are concerned with what others do, and proper rights are self-regarding, are concerned only with what you do, not with what others do. And if rights are limited to self-regarding matters, then the paradox may not arise, then respecting rights may be compatible with Pareto efficiency. And this response requires distinguishing between self-regarding and other regarding preferences, between preferences about your own life and preferences about others' lives. And liberalism protects the former, but not the latter, and this resolves the paradox by restricting the domain of rights, by denying that Prude has a right to prevent Lude from reading, even if Prude prefers that outcome. Another response accepts the paradox, accepts that rights sometimes block Pareto improvements, and argues that this is acceptable, that rights are constraints on social choice, are not mere preferences to be aggregated, but are protections that cannot be violated, even for welfare gains. And this deontological response treats rights as absolute, as trumps over welfare, and accepts that respecting rights may produce outcomes that everyone prefers to avoid. And this response is consistent with rights-based liberalism, with the view that individual freedom is foundational, is not negotiable, and welfare considerations cannot override rights. And the paradox is accepted as showing the cost of rights, showing that freedom has trade-offs. A third response questions the Pareto principle, argues that unanimous preferences should not always be respected, that preference satisfaction is not always good. And in Sen's example, the preferences are meddlesome, are concerned with interfering in others' choices, and perhaps such preferences should not count, should not be given weight in social choice. And this response modifies the Pareto principle to exclude meddlesome preferences, to respect only preferences about self-regarding matters. And this resolves the paradox by restricting the domain of preferences that matter for social choice. And this approach has some support, has intuitive appeal, because it seems wrong to let people's preferences about others' private behaviour determine social outcomes, seems to give too much weight to intolerance or judgment. The liberal paradox also connects to debates about paternalism, about whether societies should prevent people from making choices that harm themselves, and paternalism violates minimal liberalism, overrides individual choice for welfare reasons, and the paradox shows why such overriding might be tempting, shows that respecting choice can produce outcomes that the chooser prefers to avoid, and this creates pressure toward paternalism, toward intervention, but liberalism resists, maintains that individual choice must be respected even when it leads to regret. And the tension between respecting choice and promoting welfare is permanent, is built into liberal theory, and the paradox makes it explicit. Some argue that the liberal paradox is merely theoretical, is unlikely in practice, requires specific preference structures that rarely occur, and empirical investigation of whether such structures exist would be valuable, but regardless of frequency, the paradox is important as a logical possibility, as a demonstration that liberal principles can conflict. And this shows that liberalism requires trade-offs, requires balancing competing values, and political philosophy must grapple with these trade-offs rather than assuming that liberal values are always compatible. The paradox also raises questions about whether societies should recognize rights at all, whether individual sovereignty over personal matters is justified if it can lead to collectively worse outcomes. And consequentialists might use the paradox to argue against rights, to argue that social choice should be based on welfare alone, without constraints from individual rights. But most find this conclusion extreme, find that rights are valuable despite potential conflicts with welfare, and the challenge is to specify rights carefully, to balance rights and welfare, to create institutions that respect both as much as possible while recognizing that perfect compatibility is impossible. Prude and Lude exercise their rights, make their choices, and the outcome satisfies liberal principles, but violates Pareto efficiency, and both prefer an alternative, but that alternative requires violating someone's rights, requires overriding someone's choice, and the paradox stands unresolved, showing that liberalism contains tensions, that freedom and welfare can conflict, that rights and preferences can diverge, and the liberal paradox endures as one of the important impossibility results in social choice theory, as a challenge to liberal political philosophy, as a demonstration that liberal values are not perfectly compatible. And the paradox remains a permanent feature of liberal theory, requiring careful navigation, requiring trade-offs between competing values, and showing that coherent liberalism is more complex than it appears. The non-identity problem. Why creating a disabled child? Seems wrong, but harms no one. A woman takes medication that she knows will cause her future child to be born with a disability that will significantly reduce the child's quality of life, but will not make life so bad that it is not worth living, and the child will live with chronic pain, with limited mobility, with challenges that most people do not face. But the child will still experience joy and love and meaning, and life will be worth living overall, just harder, just less good than it could have been. And we are inclined to say that the woman did something wrong, that she should have stopped taking the medication, should have waited until it cleared her system before conceiving. And if she had waited, she would have conceived a different child, a healthy child. And this seems like the obviously right choice, but now philosopher Derek Parfit poses a troubling question. Who exactly was harmed by the woman's choice? Who was made worse off? And the answer is puzzling, because the disabled child cannot claim to have been harmed. Because if the woman had waited and conceived a different child, then this particular child would not exist at all, and the disabled child's only alternative to existing with a disability is not existing. And existing with a disability, as long as life is worth living, is better than not existing. And so the disabled child is not worse off, is actually better off for existing. And if no one was harmed, then how can the action be wrong? And this is the non-identity problem, a puzzle about how to ground judgments of wrongness in cases where the identity of affected individuals depends on the choices being evaluated. Imagine the scenario more carefully. At time 1, the woman is taking medication, and she has a choice: conceive now and have a disabled child, or wait a month, stop the medication, and conceive a healthy child. And suppose she chooses to conceive now, and 9 months later, a child is born with a disability. Call this child Alex, and Alex grows up facing challenges, but also experiencing good things. And on balance, Alex is glad to be alive, prefers existing to not existing. And now we ask whether the woman wronged Alex, whether Alex was harmed by the woman's choice. And the problem is that the alternative was not Alex without the disability. The alternative was a different child entirely, because different sperm and egg would have united if the woman had waited, and different genetic material produces a different person. And so Alex's options were either exist with the disability or not exist at all. And Alex is better off existing with the disability than not existing. And so how can Alex complain? How can Alex say the woman wronged them, when the only other possibility is non-existence? And if Alex cannot complain, then who can? And if no one can complain, then in what sense was the action wrong? The problem generalizes beyond this specific case. It arises whenever a choice affects who will exist rather than merely affecting how existing people will fare. And these cases are called non-identity cases, and they include decisions about environmental policy, where current generations choose between policies that affect which future people will exist. Decisions about genetic engineering, where parents choose traits for children who would not exist without that choice. Decisions about timing of reproduction, where different times lead to different children. And in all these cases, the people affected by the choice cannot claim they would have been better off if a different choice had been made, because they would not have existed if a different choice had been made. And so, Standard harm-based reasoning seems to fail, seems unable to explain why these choices might be wrong. Visualize the problem as a branching tree. At the decision point, two branches extend. On one branch, a child with disability exists. On the other branch, a different healthy child exists. And we compare the two branches and say the second is better, produces a better outcome, a healthier child, less suffering, more well-being. But when we try to say who benefits from choosing the second branch, we cannot point to anyone. The disabled child does not benefit because that child does not exist in the second branch. The healthy child does not benefit because that child does not exist in the first branch. And so there is no person who is made better off by choosing the better branch. And this seems to undermine the claim that the better outcome is better for anyone. And yet we strongly feel that the choice matters, that creating a child with avoidable disability is wrong. Parfit proposed the non-identity problem as a challenge to person-affecting principles. Principles that say an action is wrong only if it makes someone worse off. And these principles work well for ordinary cases where the same people exist regardless of the choice, but they fail for non-identity cases where different choices lead to different people existing. And if we want to maintain that choices in non-identity cases can be wrong, we must adopt impersonal principles, principles that evaluate outcomes based on total or average well-being, or some other measure that does not depend on comparing how well-off particular individuals are across different choices. But impersonal principles face their own difficulties. They can imply things like the repugnant conclusion. They can recommend creating vast populations with minimal welfare, and they can conflict with intuitions about person-relative reasons and obligations. One response to the non-identity problem is to reject the claim that wrongness requires harming someone, to argue that some actions are wrong, even though they do not make anyone worse off, and creating a child with an avoidable disability is wrong. Not because it harms the child, but because it fails to give the child the best start in life, violates a duty to create the best children we can, and this response requires specifying what duties we have regarding procreation, what standards of care apply to potential children, and whether these duties are owed to specific individuals or are impersonal obligations about making the world better. Another response is to argue that the disabled child is harmed after all, harmed relative to an appropriate baseline, and the baseline is not non-existence, but rather the life the child could have had if different choices had been made, even though those choices would have resulted in a different child. We can still say that creating a child with avoidable disability is wrong because it brings into existence someone whose life contains avoidable suffering. And this suffering is bad even if it does not make anyone worse off compared to any alternative where that same person exists. And this response requires defending an impersonal notion of harm. Harm that is not comparative, not based on counterfactuals about specific individuals, but based on the presence of bad states like suffering. A third response is to bite the bullet and accept that the action is not wrong, that if no one is harmed, then nothing bad has happened. And this response embraces person-affecting principles and accepts their implications even in non-identity cases, admits that we cannot say the woman wronged the disabled child, cannot say she should have waited, and while this seems counterintuitive, perhaps our intuitions are wrong, perhaps we are confused about non-identity cases, and the theoretical clarity of person-affecting principles outweighs the cost of accepting counterintuitive conclusions. The non-identity problem has practical implications for reproductive ethics, for decisions about genetic screening, prenatal testing, selective abortion, and genetic modification, because many of these decisions are non-identity cases where choosing one option means one child exists, and choosing another means a different child exists. And if we cannot say these choices harm anyone, then it becomes difficult to regulate them. Difficult to say parents have obligations about which children to create. And yet most people feel strongly that some procreative choices are wrong, that parents should not knowingly create children with serious avoidable disabilities, that we have reasons to prefer healthy children, and these feelings need grounding, need principles that explain why these choices matter, even though no particular person is made worse off. The woman stands at the choice point, medication in hand, and she can conceive now or wait, can create a child with disability or create a different healthy child, and the choice seems obvious. And yet when we try to justify the obvious answer, try to explain why waiting is better, the justification becomes elusive, slips through our fingers, because no one is harmed by conceiving now. The child who exists is glad to exist, and the child who would exist if she waited does not exist to be disappointed. And the non-identity problem reveals a gap in our moral thinking, a case where our judgments are clear, but our reasons are unclear, where standard moral frameworks fail to explain intuitions we hold strongly, and Parfit's problem remains unsolved, challenging, forcing recognition that identity matters, that who exists matters, and that moral philosophy has not yet developed adequate tools for handling cases where choices determine who exists rather than merely how well existing people fare. And the problem persists, technical and troubling, a reminder that even procreation, the most basic of human activities, raises profound ethical puzzles that resist easy answers. The paradox of analysis, how explaining something makes it meaningless. A philosopher attempts to analyze a concept, to provide a definition that captures its meaning precisely, and suppose the concept is knowledge, and the philosopher proposes that knowledge is justified true belief. And this analysis, if correct, should be informative, should tell us something we did not already know about what knowledge is, should illuminate the concept by breaking it down into simpler components. But here emerges a paradox articulated by C.H. Langford and discussed extensively by G.E. Moore, because if the analysis is correct, then the analysandum, the concept being analysed, and the analysans, the analysis itself, must have the same meaning, must be synonymous, otherwise the analysis would be incorrect, would not capture what knowledge really is. But if they are synonymous, then stating the analysis provides no new information, becomes a tautology, becomes equivalent to saying knowledge is knowledge, which is trivial, tells us nothing. And so the analysis cannot be both correct and informative. If it is correct, then it is trivial. If it is informative, then it is not a genuine analysis, but merely a stipulation or a proposed change of meaning. And this is the paradox of analysis, a puzzle about whether conceptual analysis is even possible, whether we can both correctly identify the meaning of a concept and provide new insight into that concept. Imagine presenting the analysis to someone who understands the concept of knowledge, who uses the word correctly, who can distinguish cases where knowledge is present from cases where it is absent, and you tell them that knowledge is justified true belief. And if they already knew this, if the definition merely makes explicit what was implicit in their understanding, then the analysis is correct but uninformative, tells them nothing new. But if they learn something, if the analysis reveals something they did not already know, then it seems the analysis is changing the concept rather than analysing it, is offering a new concept rather than clarifying the old one. And either way, the analysis fails to do what philosophical analysis is supposed to do, both correctly identify meaning and provide insight. The paradox challenges the entire enterprise of conceptual analysis, challenges the method that has been central to analytic philosophy for over a century, the method of taking ordinary concepts like knowledge, justice, truth, and providing precise definitions. And if the paradox cannot be resolved, then conceptual analysis is either impossible or pointless. Either it cannot be done correctly, or when done correctly, it provides no insight. And this threatens one of philosophy's main methods, forces philosophers to reconsider what they're doing when they offer analyses, what counts as success and whether analysis is discovery or stipulation. Visualize the paradox as a dilemma, On one horn, the analysans and analysandum are synonymous, have the same meaning, and the analysis is correct but trivial, like saying a bachelor is an unmarried man, which is true but uninformative because anyone who understands the word bachelor already knows this. And on the other horn, the analysans and analysandum differ in meaning, and the analysis is informative but incorrect, provides new information but does not capture what the original concept meant. And either way, the analysis fails to achieve the goal of being both correct and informative. And the paradox seems to show that this goal is impossible, that correctness and informativeness are incompatible in conceptual analysis. One response distinguishes between sense and reference, between how a concept is presented and what it refers to, and argues that an analysis can have the same reference as the analysandum while differing in sense, and so the analysis is informative because it presents the concept differently, makes explicit aspects that were implicit even though it refers to the same thing, and the analysis knowledge is justified. True belief is informative because even though knowledge and justified true belief refer to the same set of cases, they present those cases differently, one as a simple concept and the other as a complex structure. And learning the structure is learning something new even though the reference remains the same. And this response draws on Frege's distinction between sense and reference, uses it to explain how analyses can be both correct and informative. Another response appeals to implicit versus explicit knowledge, argues that competent speakers have implicit understanding of concepts, understand how to use them correctly, but lack explicit understanding, cannot state the definition, and conceptual analysis makes implicit knowledge explicit, converts procedural knowledge into propositional knowledge, and this conversion is informative even though it does not add to what was implicitly known, and the analysis is correct because it captures the implicit understanding and informative because it makes that understanding explicit and available for reflection. And so the paradox dissolves because correctness and informativeness are compatible when we recognize that knowledge comes in implicit and explicit forms. A third response questions whether analyses are meant to be synonymous, argues that philosophical analyses are not claims about linguistic meaning, but claims about the nature of things, about what knowledge really is, about its essential properties, and knowledge is justified. True belief is not a claim about what the word means, but a claim about what knowledge consists in, about its metaphysical structure. And this claim can be informative, even if it is necessarily true, even if knowledge could not be otherwise, because discovering necessary truths is informative. Learning that water is H2O was informative, even though it is necessarily true that water is H2O, and so philosophical analysis is more like scientific discovery than like lexicography, more like finding out what things are than like defining words. And the paradox assumes the wrong model of analysis. The paradox also connects to debates about analyticity and the analytic-synthetic distinction, because if analyses are analytic truths, true in virtue of meaning, then they should be trivial, should be knowable a priori just by understanding the concepts. But many proposed analyses are controversial, are rejected by competent speakers, and this suggests either that analyses are not analytic, or that analyticity is more complex than traditionally thought. And Quine's critique of the analytic-synthetic distinction can be seen as embracing the paradox, as arguing that there are no purely analytic truths, that all statements are revisable, that meaning and fact are not sharply separated, and so philosophical analyses are not discoveries of meaning, but proposals for how to understand concepts, and their value is pragmatic, depends on whether they illuminate, rather than whether they are correct in some absolute sense. The paradox remains unresolved. Different philosophers offer different solutions based on different theories of meaning and different conceptions of what philosophical analysis aims to achieve. And the paradox continues to challenge the methodology of analytic philosophy. forces ongoing reflection on what analysis is, what it can accomplish, and whether the goals of correctness and informativeness can be reconciled, or whether philosophy must choose between them. And the concept of knowledge sits waiting for analysis, and the philosopher proposes justified true belief. And the question remains whether this is a discovery or a stipulation, whether it is correct or informative, or neither or both. And the paradox persists, a puzzle about philosophy's methods, about whether conceptual analysis is possible, about the relationship between understanding and articulation, between implicit grasp and explicit formulation, and whether the attempt to make our concepts precise enriches or distorts them, captures their meaning or creates new meanings. And the paradox endures as a permanent challenge to philosophical methodology, a question about whether philosophy can deliver on its promise to analyze and clarify concepts, or whether the very attempt to analyze creates a problem that cannot be solved without giving up either the goal of correctness or the goal of informativeness. And the analysis hangs there, proposed but problematic, informative or correct, but not both, and the paradox remains. The paradox of democracy, when majority rule destroys itself. A democratic society values freedom and equality, gives every citizen voice, allows majority rule to determine policy, and this seems just, seems fair, seems like the best system for governance. And yet democracy contains internal tensions, contains paradoxes that threaten its stability, and one fundamental paradox asks, what democracy should do when the majority votes to end democracy? When the people use democratic procedures to elect authoritarian leaders who promise to dismantle democratic institutions? And if democracy respects majority, will it must allow this outcome, must permit its own destruction? But if democracy forbids this outcome, prevents the majority from choosing authoritarianism, then it violates its own principles, acts undemocratically. And this is the paradox of democracy, the recognition that democracy's commitment to majority rule can lead to outcomes that destroy democracy itself. And navigating this paradox requires balancing competing values, requires defending democracy sometimes against democratic procedures, requires recognizing that procedural democracy is not sufficient, that substantive commitments to rights and freedoms are necessary to preserve democracy. And this paradox has been central to political philosophy since ancient times, was recognized by Plato, who argued that democracy tends toward tyranny, and the paradox remains relevant today as democratic societies face authoritarian movements that use democratic means to gain power. Imagine an election where an authoritarian party campaigns on promises to restrict freedoms, to eliminate checks and balances, to concentrate power, to end future elections, and this party wins a majority, wins through legitimate democratic procedures, through free and fair voting, and now the society faces a choice. Honour the election results and allow democracy to be dismantled, or override the results and preserve democracy by undemocratic means. And neither option is satisfactory. Both involve betraying core democratic values. And the paradox emerges from the fact that democracy values both procedural fairness and substantive freedoms. And these can conflict. Majority can threaten minority rights, can threaten the institutions that make democracy possible. And when conflict occurs, democracy faces an impossible choice. Preserve procedure or preserve substance, respect majority, will or defend fundamental freedoms. The paradox connects to Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance, the recognition that unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance, that tolerant societies must be intolerant of intolerance to survive. And the same structure applies to democracy. Unlimited democracy, democracy that respects all majority decisions regardless of content, leads to the disappearance of democracy. And democratic societies must be undemocratic toward anti-democratic movements to preserve democracy, and this creates the paradox. Democracy must violate its principles to preserve its principles, must act undemocratically to remain democratic. And this tension is permanent, is inherent in the structure of democracy, cannot be fully resolved, but must be managed through careful balancing of competing considerations. Visualize democracy as having two aspects: procedural democracy, which emphasizes voting, majority rule, fair elections, and substantive democracy, which emphasizes rights, freedoms, protections for minorities, and ideally these aspects reinforce each other. Procedures protect rights and rights enable procedures, but they can conflict. Procedures can be used to undermine rights, majorities can vote to restrict freedoms, and when conflict occurs, the society must choose which aspect to prioritize, and different societies make different choices. Constitutional democracies emphasize substantive protections, have constitutions that limit majority power, protect fundamental rights even against majority will, and these systems accept that democracy involves more than majority rule, involves commitments to principles that cannot be overridden by votes. And this resolves the paradox partially, makes democracy less purely procedural, more substantively constrained. One response to the paradox argues that true democracy is substantive, not procedural, that democracy is not just about voting, but about respecting rights, protecting minorities, ensuring freedom. And when these substantive commitments are threatened, even by majority vote, democracy requires defending them, requires overriding the majority. And this militant democracy, this democracy that defends itself against anti-democratic forces, is not a betrayal of democracy, but is its preservation, is necessary to maintain the conditions that make democracy possible. And historical examples support this. Societies that failed to restrict anti-democratic movements, that allowed authoritarians to use democratic procedures to gain power, lost their democracies, and hindsight suggests that early intervention, that militant defense would have been justified, would have preserved democracy even though it involved undemocratic means. Another response distinguishes between procedural rules and constitutional principles, argues that democracies should have entrenched principles that cannot be changed by ordinary procedures, that require supermajorities or constitutional amendments, and these entrenched principles include fundamental rights, democratic structures, and protections for minorities. And ordinary majorities can make policy within these constraints, but cannot override the principles themselves. And this response preserves both procedural and substantive democracy, allows majority rule within limits. And the paradox is resolved by recognizing that democracy is hierarchical, has constitutional principles at one level and democratic procedures at another, and procedures operate within the framework set by principles, and this framework is not itself subject to ordinary democratic revision. A third response embraces the paradox, accepts that democracy is inherently unstable, inherently vulnerable to self-destruction, and argues that this vulnerability is a price worth paying for freedom, that the alternative, restricting democracy to protect democracy, is worse than the risk of democratic collapse. And this radical democratic response trusts in the people, trusts that majorities will not choose their own oppression, and when they do, the society pays the price. And this response is rare. Most societies are unwilling to risk democratic collapse, prefer to impose constraints on democracy, but the response represents one coherent position, one way of resolving the paradox by accepting its consequences. The paradox also appears in debates about hate speech, about whether democracies should allow speech that advocates for the destruction of democracy, speech that promotes authoritarianism or discrimination. And free speech is a democratic value, is protected in democratic societies. But speech that aims to destroy democracy creates the paradox, and banning such speech seems undemocratic, seems to violate free expression, but allowing it risks democracy's survival. And different democracies resolve this differently. Some ban anti-democratic speech, some allow it, and no resolution is without costs. All involve trade-offs between competing values. The election results are counted, the authoritarian party has won, and the democratic society faces the paradox: honour the results and risk losing democracy, or override the results and betray democratic procedures. And the choice is not theoretical, is faced by real societies, has been faced throughout history, and different societies have chosen differently. Some have preserved democracy by undemocratic means, some have respected procedures and lost democracy, and the paradox remains unresolved, remains a permanent tension in democratic governance. A challenge that every democracy must navigate, must balance procedure against substance, must defend itself without betraying itself. And the paradox of democracy endures as a fundamental problem in political philosophy, a recognition that democracy contains contradictions, that majority rule can lead to minority oppression, that freedom can be voted away, and that preserving democracy sometimes requires limiting democracy. And the tension persists. The balance is delicate, and the paradox remains unsolved, a permanent feature of democratic life. The paradox of non-being, how nothing cannot be talked about. A philosopher attempts to state a simple truth, attempts to say that something does not exist, attempts to assert that unicorns are not real, that they have no being, that they are nothing, and yet stating this seems impossible, seems paradoxical, because to say that unicorns do not exist is to say something about unicorns, is to refer to them, to make them the subject of a statement. And how can you refer to what does not exist? How can you make something the subject of a statement if that something is nothing, if it has no being? And if you can refer to unicorns, then they must be something, must have some kind of being. But then the statement unicorns do not exist is false, is contradictory, because it refers to things that it claims do not exist. And this is the paradox of non-being, first articulated by Plato in the Sophist, the puzzle about how negative existential statements are possible, how we can truly say that something does not exist without contradicting ourselves, without presupposing the existence of what we are denying exists. And this paradox has troubled metaphysics throughout history, has generated multiple solutions, and remains a test case for theories of reference and existence. Imagine trying to deny the existence of something, trying to say that Zeus does not exist, that there is no such God, and the statement seems straightforward, seems obviously true, but analysing the statement reveals problems because the statement is about Zeus, makes Zeus the subject, and subjects of statements must be something, must have reference, must be objects that the statement is about. And if Zeus is the subject, then Zeus must exist in some sense, must be something rather than nothing. But the statement says Zeus does not exist, says Zeus is nothing. And so the statement seems self-refuting, seems to both presuppose and deny the existence of its subject. And this is the paradox, that negative existentials, statements denying existence, seem impossible to state without contradiction. Parmenides made this paradox central to his philosophy, argued that non-being cannot be spoken of or thought about, because speaking and thinking require objects, require that there be something that is spoken of or thought about, and non-being is not something, is nothing, and so non-being is inexpressible, unthinkable, and from this Parmenides concluded that non-being does not exist, that everything that is exists, that reality is one unchanging being, and change is impossible because change would require something to come into being from non-being or to pass into non-being, and both are impossible. And this radical conclusion follows from taking the paradox of non-being seriously, from accepting that we cannot coherently speak of what does not exist. Visualize the paradox as a linguistic trap. When you say X does not exist, you seem to refer to X, and reference requires that X be something, and if X is something, then X exists. And so the statement is self-refuting, and yet negative existentials seem to be true, seem to be among the most basic truths. And we need to explain how they can be true without contradiction, how we can deny existence without presupposing it. And this requires a theory of reference that allows reference to non-existence, or that reinterprets negative existentials so they do not really refer to their apparent subjects. One solution proposed by Russell denies that names like Zeus refer to objects, analyzes them as disguised descriptions, and Zeus does not exist becomes, there is no unique object that has all the properties attributed to Zeus in mythology. And this existential statement does not refer to Zeus, does not presuppose any object, but simply denies that the description is satisfied. And this allows negative existentials to be true, without paradox, without reference to non-existence. And Russell's theory of descriptions has been widely adopted as solving the paradox, as showing that negative existentials do not actually have the logical form they appear to have, do not refer to their apparent subjects. Another solution from free logic distinguishes between existence and reference, allows that terms can refer without presupposing existence, and negative existentials are statements that deny existence while preserving reference, and this requires revising classical logic, requires allowing that some terms refer to nothing, are empty names, and statements containing empty names can still be meaningful, can still have truth values. And Zeus does not exist is true because Zeus is an empty name, refers to nothing, and the statement denies existence without presupposing it. And free logic has been developed extensively, provides formal semantics for empty names, and handles the paradox by liberalizing logic to allow reference without existence. A third solution, from Meinongian approaches, accepts that non-existent objects are real in a broad sense, have being even if they lack existence, and Zeus does not exist is true, because Zeus is a non-existent object, has being but lacks existence, and statements about Zeus refer to this non-existent object. And the paradox is dissolved because reference does not require existence, only requires being, and non-existent objects have being, have properties, can be subjects of true statements. And this solution preserves the intuition that negative existentials refer to their subjects, while denying that reference requires existence. The paradox also appears in discussions of nothingness, of absolute non-being, because to say that absolute nothing is impossible seems to require referring to absolute nothing, making it the subject of a statement, and if it is the subject then it must be something. And so the statement that nothing is impossible presupposes that nothing is something. And this generates contradiction, and Heidegger made this paradox central to his philosophy, explored the nature of nothingness, argued that nothing is not a thing but is the horizon of being, the possibility of non-being that makes being intelligible. And discussing nothing requires special language, requires recognizing that nothing is not an object but is something more fundamental. And the paradox shows limits of ordinary language, shows that metaphysics pushes language beyond its designed capacities. Some philosophers embrace the paradox, accept that there are true contradictions, dialetheas, statements that are both true and false, and negative existentials are examples, are both true because they correctly deny existence, and false because they refer to their subjects, and reference presupposes existence. And this paraconsistent approach accepts contradiction, develops logics that allow true contradictions without explosion, without allowing everything to be provable. And while controversial, paraconsistent logic provides one way of handling the paradox, accepts that negative existentials are genuinely paradoxical, are both true and false. The statement stands: Zeus does not exist, unicorns are not real, nothing is something, and the paradox remains, hovering over negative existentials, challenging theories of reference, forcing recognition that denying existence is not as simple as it seems, that we cannot straightforwardly say that something is nothing without creating logical tension, and the paradox of non-being endures as one of the oldest problems in philosophy, a problem recognized by Plato, central to Parmenides, unresolved by centuries of analysis. And various solutions exist, various ways of dissolving or accepting the paradox, but no consensus emerges, and the paradox persists, a reminder that language struggles to express non-existence, that negation creates puzzles, and that the boundary between being and non-being resists clear articulation. The paradox of choice, why having everything makes us want nothing. A shopper stands in the cereal aisle of a modern supermarket, surrounded by hundreds of options, dozens of brands, each offering multiple varieties, chocolate cereals and fruit cereals and granola and organic options and sugar-free options and high-fiber options. And the shopper came with a simple goal, to buy cereal, but now faces a wall of choices, and minutes pass. Then more minutes, as the shopper reads labels, compares prices, weighs nutritional content against taste preferences, and the simple task becomes exhausting, becomes overwhelming, and eventually the shopper either picks something randomly just to escape the aisle, or leaves without buying anything at all, paralyzed by too many options. And this is the paradox of choice, articulated by psychologist Barry Schwartz. The observation that while having some choice is better than having none, having too many choices can actually make us worse off, can lead to decision paralysis, anxiety, dissatisfaction, and regret. And this paradox challenges the assumption that more freedom and more options always lead to better outcomes, suggests instead that there is an optimal amount of choice beyond which additional options become burdensome rather than beneficial. Imagine living in a world with few choices, a small village where there is one type of bread, one kind of shoe, limited options for occupation and lifestyle, and people generally wear what everyone wears, eat what everyone eats, follow the paths that tradition provides. And this limited choice can feel constraining, can prevent people from finding what truly suits them, can force them into roles and lifestyles that do not fit, but it also simplifies life, reduces the cognitive burden of decision-making, provides clear social scripts and expectations, and people in such societies often report high satisfaction because expectations are managed, because the gap between what they have and what they could have is small. And now contrast this with modern, affluent societies where choice proliferates endlessly, where every decision, from what to eat for breakfast to what career to pursue, involves navigating vast option spaces. And while this freedom allows for personalization, allows people to find exactly what they want, it also creates anxiety, creates the constant question of whether a better option exists, whether the choice made was optimal. And this anxiety erodes satisfaction even when the chosen option is good, because the existence of unchosen alternatives haunts the decision. The paradox operates through several psychological mechanisms. First is decision paralysis. When faced with too many options, the cognitive load of evaluating them becomes overwhelming. And rather than carefully comparing all options, people either make hasty decisions to escape the complexity or defer the decision entirely, avoid choosing at all. And this is why offering more product varieties can sometimes decrease sales, why adding options can reduce rather than increase engagement, because each additional option adds to the burden of decision-making, and at some point the burden exceeds the benefit and people opt out. Second is regret and second-guessing. When there are many options and you choose one, the existence of all the unchosen options creates opportunity for regret, creates the thought that perhaps one of the other options would have been better, and this regret is stronger when there are more alternatives because each alternative represents a path not taken, a potential source of better outcomes. And so the chosen option must compete not just with reality, but with imagination, with idealized versions of what the unchosen options might have provided, and actual outcomes rarely exceed these idealized counterfactuals. And so satisfaction decreases even when the choice is good, and this effect is amplified when choices are reversible, when you can change your mind, because reversibility keeps all options perpetually open, prevents commitment, prevents the psychological closure that comes from accepting a decision as final. Third is the escalation of expectations. When there are few options, we expect less. We accept what is available and feel grateful if it is good. But when there are many options, we expect to find exactly what we want, expect the perfect fit, and our standards rise. And this rising threshold means that good outcomes feel merely adequate rather than excellent. And satisfaction depends not on absolute quality, but on the gap between expectations and reality. And more choice raises expectations faster than it improves outcomes. And so, the net effect is decreased satisfaction, despite better products and more freedom. Visualize a graph with number of options on one axis and satisfaction on the other. And the relationship is not linear, but inverted U-shaped. Satisfaction rises as options increase from 0 to some moderate number, perhaps 5 or 10, because having some choice allows people to find something that fits their preferences. But beyond that optimal point, satisfaction begins to decline. And at very high numbers of options, satisfaction may even fall below the level experienced with minimal choice, because the cognitive and emotional costs of choosing exceed the benefits of additional options. And this inverted U captures the paradox, shows that more is not always better, that optimization requires moderation, that there is such a thing as too much freedom. The paradox has practical implications for product design, marketing, and policy. Companies that offer too many products may overwhelm customers and reduce sales, while companies that curate their offerings, that limit choice to a manageable set of high-quality options, may increase satisfaction and loyalty. And this is why successful brands often limit their product lines, why Apple offers relatively few models compared to competitors, why some restaurants have short menus. The limitation is not a failure, but a strategy, a recognition that customers benefit from being protected from too much choice, from having the decision space narrowed by experts who have already done the filtering. The paradox also affects personal life and well-being. Modern individuals face an unprecedented number of choices about identity, lifestyle, career, relationships, and consumption. And while this freedom is liberating in principle, in practice it can be exhausting, can create a sense of being overwhelmed, can generate anxiety about missing out on better options, and research shows that people in societies with more choice are not necessarily happier, that reported life satisfaction has not increased proportionally with the explosion of options, and some argue it has decreased, that the paradox of choice contributes to rising rates of anxiety and depression, that the burden of constructing a life from infinite options without clear guidance is a source of modern malaise. One response to the paradox is to adopt satisficing rather than maximizing as a decision strategy. Maximizers seek the best option, the optimal choice, and this requires evaluating all possibilities, comparing exhaustively, and the process is endless because there is always the possibility that a better option exists somewhere. While satisficers set a threshold of good enough and choose the first option that meets that threshold, and satisficers experience less stress, less regret, and higher satisfaction because they commit to good options without torturing themselves about whether better options exist. And embracing satisficing is a way to opt out of the paradox, to limit self-imposed choice burden even when external options are numerous. Another response is to establish routines and defaults, to make decisions once and then follow the decision automatically in the future, to reduce the number of active choices required. And this is why successful people often simplify their lives, wear the same clothes every day, eat the same breakfast, follow the same schedule, not because they lack creativity, but because they recognize that decision-making is a limited resource, that every choice consumes cognitive energy, and preserving that energy for important decisions requires eliminating trivial choices through routinization. A third response is to embrace constraints, to deliberately limit options, to refuse to consider all possibilities, and this might involve setting rules like, I only shop at this store, or I only consider jobs in this city. And these self-imposed constraints reduce the choice space, make decisions more manageable, and paradoxically increase freedom by preventing paralysis, by ensuring that decisions get made rather than deferred indefinitely. And constraints are not limitations on freedom, but conditions for effective exercise of freedom, structures that enable choice rather than preventing it. The shopper stands in the cereal aisle, paralyzed by options, and eventually walks away empty-handed or grabs something arbitrarily, and the experience is repeated across modern life, in career choices and relationship decisions and consumption patterns, and the paradox persists. More choice leading to less satisfaction, more freedom creating more anxiety. And Schwartz's insight remains relevant, challenges the ideology of unlimited choice, suggests that well-being requires moderation, requires protection from too much optionality, and the paradox endures as a reminder that freedom is complex, that having options is valuable, but that value has limits, that beyond a certain point additional options become burdens rather than benefits. And the challenge for individuals and societies is to find the optimal level of choice, the sweet spot where there is enough freedom to allow for genuine self-determination, but not so much that the burden of choosing overwhelms the benefit of having chosen. And the paradox remains a feature of modern affluent societies, a price paid for abundance, and a problem that requires not more choice but wiser choice, not more options but better frameworks for navigating options. And the cereal aisle waits, endless and overwhelming, and the shopper eventually learns to bring a list to decide in advance, to opt out of the paradox by refusing to treat every shopping trip as an opportunity for exhaustive optimization. The paradox of the court, when a student's promise becomes impossible to keep. An ancient story tells of a law teacher named Protagoras and his student Euathlus, and they make an agreement. The student is too poor to pay tuition up front, and so they agree that the student will pay the teacher after winning his first court case. And the teacher provides instruction, teaches the student rhetoric and law and argumentation, and the student completes his training, becomes skilled in legal reasoning, but then the student never takes a case, never appears in court, never wins anything, and years pass and the teacher has not been paid, and finally the teacher sues the student, takes him to court to demand payment. And now the paradox emerges because the case creates a logical impossibility, a situation where no judgment can be coherent, where the law contradicts itself. And this is the paradox of the court, also called Protagoras' paradox, a puzzle about legal reasoning, contracts, and self-reference that has no satisfactory solution. Imagine the trial. The teacher presents his case, arguing first that if he wins the lawsuit, then the court will order the student to pay, and the student will be legally obligated to pay the agreed tuition. And second, that if he loses the lawsuit, then the student has won his first case. And according to the original agreement, the student must pay after winning his first case. And so, either way, the student must pay, whether the court rules for the teacher or for the student. The contract ensures payment, and this argument seems impeccable, seems to show that the student cannot avoid payment, that filing the lawsuit was a clever move, that forces the student into a position where any outcome requires payment. But now the student, trained in rhetoric by the teacher himself, presents a counter-argument of equal force, arguing first that if he wins the lawsuit, then the court will rule in his favour, and he will not be legally obligated to pay. And second, that if he loses the lawsuit, then he has not won his first case. And according to the original agreement, he only pays after winning his first case. And so either way, he does not have to pay. Whether the court rules for him or against him, the contract protects him from payment. And this argument also seems impeccable, seems to show that the student cannot be forced to pay, that the lawsuit was a mistake that creates a situation where no outcome requires payment. Visualize the judge sitting in court, listening to both arguments, recognizing that both are logically valid, Both follow from the premises, both reach opposite conclusions, and the judge must render a verdict, must decide whether the student pays or does not pay. But any decision seems arbitrary, seems to violate logic, because if the judge rules for the teacher, then the student wins his first case and does not have to pay, according to the contract. And if the judge rules for the student, then the student loses and does have to pay, according to the contract. And so, the judge's decision determines the opposite of what it declares, creates a self-contradicting outcome, and the law becomes incoherent, and the case cannot be decided without paradox. The paradox reveals a problem with self-referential contracts, contracts whose terms depend on the outcome of litigation about those very terms, because such contracts create loops, create situations where the contract's fulfillment depends on whether the contract is enforced, and whether it is enforced depends on whether it is fulfilled. And this circular dependency generates contradictions, makes it impossible to apply the law consistently, and the paradox shows that some contracts, even if agreed to voluntarily by competent parties, are legally unenforceable. Not because they violate public policy or lack consideration, but because they are logically incoherent, because no court can implement them without contradiction. One proposed resolution is to distinguish between two different questions: the question of whether the student owes the teacher money according to the contract, and the question of whether the court should order the student to pay. And these are separate issues. The contract might create an obligation that the court nonetheless refuses to enforce, and the court could rule in favour of the student on the narrow question of whether the lawsuit succeeds, while still recognising that the student has a moral obligation under the contract to pay once he wins his first case elsewhere. And this resolution separates legal enforcement from contractual obligation, allows both arguments to be partially correct. The teacher is right that the student owes money, the student is right that the court should not order payment, and the paradox dissolves because the two contradictory outcomes apply to different questions. Another resolution appeals to temporal priority, arguing that the lawsuit itself does not count as the student's first case for purposes of the contract, because the contract was made before the lawsuit, and counting the lawsuit as the first case would mean the contract refers to itself, which creates the paradox. And so the court should interpret the contract as referring to the first case other than the lawsuit about the contract itself. And under this interpretation, if the teacher wins the lawsuit, the student must pay, because the lawsuit is not the first case that triggers payment. And if the student wins the lawsuit, the student does not pay, because the student still has not won a first case other than this one. And the paradox is resolved by excluding self-referential applications of the contract terms. A third resolution argues that the contract is void because it is impossible to perform, because there is no possible world where the terms are satisfied without contradiction, and impossible contracts are unenforceable. And so the judge should declare the contract void and dismiss the case, leaving the student with no legal obligation, but perhaps a moral obligation to pay the teacher for services rendered. And this resolution sacrifices the contract to preserve logical coherence, treats the paradox as showing that the agreement was fatally flawed from the beginning. The paradox also raises questions about the limits of freedom of contract, about whether parties should be allowed to make any agreement they choose, or whether law should refuse to enforce agreements that are logically incoherent. And most legal systems recognize some limits, refuse to enforce contracts that are impossible, illegal, or against public policy, and the paradox of the court suggests adding logical coherence as another limit, another requirement for enforceability. And this means that contracting parties cannot create obligations that are self-referentially paradoxical, cannot make agreements whose terms depend on their own enforcement in ways that generate contradictions. The paradox has modern analogues in cases involving conditional gifts and trusts, where someone leaves property to another person on condition that the recipient perform some act. And if the act is defined in terms of legal outcomes about the gift itself, then paradoxes can arise, similar to the ancient case of the teacher and student, and courts have developed various doctrines to handle these cases, generally interpreting conditions to avoid self-reference, to prevent the kind of logical loops that the paradox of the court exemplifies. The courtroom stands empty, the ancient case unresolved, the judge unable to render coherent judgment, and the paradox remains a teaching tool in logic and law, an illustration of how self-reference creates problems, how circular definitions generate contradictions, and how even voluntary agreements between competent parties can be unenforceable if their structure is logically incoherent. And Protagoras and Euathlus remain frozen in their dispute, both right and both wrong, both entitled to payment and entitled to refuse payment. And the paradox persists as a reminder that logic constrains law, that not everything that can be agreed to can be enforced, and that self-reference, whether in contracts or in statements or in rules, is a source of paradox that must be handled carefully to avoid contradiction. The omniscience paradox. Can God know what it's like to not know everything? A theologian declares that God is omniscient, all-knowing, possessing complete and perfect knowledge of everything that can be known, every fact, every truth, every possibility, past, present, and future. And this claim seems straightforward, seems like a natural attribute of a perfect being, and yet a puzzle emerges when we consider what omniscience includes, whether it encompasses not just propositional knowledge, facts that can be stated as true or false, but also experiential knowledge, the knowledge of what something feels like, what it is like to undergo certain experiences. And the paradox asks whether God knows what it is like to not know something, whether God understands the experience of ignorance, confusion, discovery, learning, and if God does know what ignorance feels like, then God must have experienced ignorance. But if God has experienced ignorance, then God was not always omniscient, and if God cannot know what ignorance feels like, then there is something God does not know. And either way, omniscience seems incomplete, seems to have gaps, and this is the omniscience paradox, a puzzle about whether complete knowledge includes knowledge of incomplete knowledge, whether knowing everything includes knowing what it is like to not know. Imagine God trying to understand human experience, trying to grasp what it feels like to be confused, to search for answers, to wonder whether something is true, to make mistakes, to learn, to have that moment of insight when understanding suddenly clicks into place after struggling. And these experiences seem to require not knowing, seem to be essentially experiences of ignorance or partial knowledge. And if God has never been ignorant, has always known everything, then God has never had these experiences, has never felt what it is like to learn. And so there is an aspect of human experience that God cannot fully understand, cannot know from the inside, and this suggests that omniscience, defined as knowing everything, is actually impossible, because knowing everything includes knowing what it is like to not know everything, and these two forms of knowledge are incompatible, cannot both be had by the same being at the same time. The paradox connects to philosophical debates about the nature of knowledge, about whether there are different kinds of knowledge that cannot be reduced to each other, propositional knowledge, knowing that something is true, and experiential knowledge, knowing what something is like. And the distinction is illustrated by cases like colour perception. A person who has never seen red but knows all the physical facts about red light, about wavelengths and retinal responses and neural processing, does not know what red looks like, does not have experiential knowledge of redness. And when they see red for the first time, they learn something new. And this suggests that experiential knowledge is distinct from propositional knowledge, cannot be obtained just by knowing facts. And if this is right, then God's omniscience, if it is purely propositional, misses something, misses the experiential dimension. And God does not know what it is like to see red for the first time, does not know what it is like to learn, does not know what ignorance feels like. Visualize the problem as a conflict between two divine attributes: omniscience, which requires always having known everything, and perfect empathy or understanding, which requires knowing what human experiences feel like from the inside. And human experiences include experiences of not knowing, and so perfect understanding seems to require having been ignorant. But omniscience seems to exclude ever being ignorant, and the two attributes pull in opposite directions, and something must give. Either God is not omniscient in the full experiential sense, or God does not fully understand human experience, or the distinction between propositional and experiential knowledge is mistaken, and God can know what ignorance feels like without ever being ignorant, through some superior form of knowledge that encompasses both facts and feelings. One theological response is to argue that God's knowledge is sui generis, is of a different kind than human knowledge, and God knows what ignorance is like, not by experiencing it, but by knowing its nature completely, by understanding all its causes and effects and phenomenal properties, and this understanding is so complete that it counts as knowing what ignorance is like, even though God has never been ignorant. And this response tries to bridge the gap between propositional and experiential knowledge, tries to say that sufficiently complete propositional knowledge includes experiential knowledge, but critics argue that this misses the point, that no amount of knowing facts about an experience captures what the experience is like, that there is an irreducible, subjective aspect that can only be known by having the experience, and so God's propositional knowledge, however complete, does not include experiential knowledge of ignorance. Another response is to embrace kenosis, the theological idea that God voluntarily limits divine attributes. And this view says that God can and does experience ignorance, that in becoming incarnate, in taking human form as Christ, God experienced human limitations, including not knowing things. And the gospel accounts support this, showing Jesus learning, growing in wisdom, not knowing when the end times would come. And this shows that God can experience ignorance without ceasing to be God, that omniscience is not essential to divinity, but is a power that can be set aside. And this resolves the paradox by denying that God is always omniscient, accepting that there are times when God voluntarily limits divine knowledge. But this creates new puzzles about whether a being that is not always omniscient can be called omniscient, and whether divine attributes can be temporary. A third response distinguishes between different kinds of ignorance, between merely not knowing a fact which God never experiences, and the phenomenology of searching for knowledge, the feeling of curiosity and discovery, which God might be able to simulate or understand through analogical reasoning, and God knows what it would be like to be in a state of ignorance, even though God is never actually in such a state. Just as someone who has never been to Mars might know what it would be like through detailed scientific knowledge and imagination, and this response tries to preserve both omniscience and experiential understanding by making experiential knowledge a form of imaginative or counterfactual knowledge. But again, critics argue that simulating or imagining an experience is not the same as having it, that there is a difference between knowing what it would be like and knowing what it is like, and God's simulated ignorance is not real ignorance and does not provide the experiential knowledge that the paradox concerns. The omniscience paradox also raises questions about divine immutability, the claim that God does not change, because if God learns or discovers anything, then God changes, gains knowledge that was previously lacking, and this violates immutability, and so perfect knowledge seems to require having always known everything, never learning, never being surprised, and yet this static, eternal knowledge seems incompatible with understanding temporal beings who do learn and are surprised, and reconciling omniscience and immutability with understanding human experience remains a challenge for classical theology. The paradox extends beyond ignorance to other experiential states. Does God know what it is like to be tempted, to feel desire for something forbidden, to struggle with moral choice? And if God is perfectly good, necessarily good, then God cannot be genuinely tempted, cannot feel the pull of evil, and so there is an aspect of human moral experience that God cannot know from the inside, and this creates distance between divine and human experience, suggests that God's understanding of humanity is necessarily incomplete, necessarily limited by God's perfection. And this is ironic, that God's perfection prevents complete understanding, that to fully know what it is like to be human, God would have to be imperfect, would have to experience weakness and ignorance and temptation, and these are incompatible with divine perfection. Some theologians embrace this limitation, argue that God's knowledge is perfect for a perfect being, but does not include the experiential knowledge of imperfection. And this is not a defect but a feature, a reflection of God's nature. And just as we do not think a perfect circle is defective because it is not a square, we should not think God is defective because God does not know what ignorance feels like, because such knowledge is incompatible with perfection. And the paradox assumes that all knowledge is good and more knowledge is always better. But perhaps some kinds of knowledge are only available through imperfection, and lacking them is not a limitation but a consequence of being perfect. Others reject omniscience entirely, argue that it is an incoherent concept, that complete knowledge is impossible, that there are always things that cannot be known, experiential states that require imperfection, future free choices that are not yet determined, logical truths that exceed any finite or infinite mind's capacity to grasp all at once. And if omniscience is impossible, then God is not omniscient, but this does not diminish God, does not make God less than perfect, because perfection means having all attributes that it is possible to have, not having impossible attributes. And omniscience, like omnipotence, when examined carefully, turns out to be impossible. And so God is not omniscient, but maximally knowledgeable, knows everything that can be known, and this is sufficient for divinity. God stands outside time, knowing all facts, all truths, all possibilities, and yet there is a gap, an experiential gap. God does not know what it feels like to search, to wonder, to be wrong, to learn. And whether this gap is a limitation or a feature remains contested, and the omniscience paradox persists, challenging the coherence of divine attributes, forcing clarification of what knowledge means, what kinds of knowledge exist, and whether complete knowledge is even possible. And the paradox remains unresolved, a permanent fixture in philosophy of religion, a reminder that even the most basic divine attributes, even the claim that God knows everything, conceal complexities and contradictions that philosophy continues to explore. The origination paradox, why you cannot create yourself. A philosopher asks where free will comes from. What makes a choice truly free, truly yours? And the answer seems to require that you be the ultimate source of your choices, that your decisions originate with you rather than being caused by factors beyond your control. And this origination, this ultimate sourcehood, seems necessary for responsibility, because if your choices are caused by factors you did not create, by genes you did not choose, by environments you did not design, by prior causes that reach back before your birth, then how are you responsible for those choices? How are they truly yours? And yet origination seems impossible, seems to require that you create yourself, that you choose your own character before you have a character to make choices with. And this is the origination paradox, the problem that free will seems to require ultimate origination, ultimate sourcehood, being the first cause of your actions, but such origination is impossible, requires creating yourself from nothing, requires existing before you exist to make the choices that create you. And this impossibility suggests that free will, understood as requiring ultimate origination, is impossible, is an incoherent concept, and responsibility is problematic. And this paradox has driven many philosophers to conclude that free will, in the strong libertarian sense, does not exist, cannot exist, and the most we can have is a weaker compatibilist freedom that does not require ultimate origination. Imagine trying to be the ultimate source of your actions, trying to take complete responsibility for what you do, and you trace back the causes of your action. Your action, was caused by your decision. Your decision was caused by your desires and beliefs. Your desires and beliefs were caused by your experiences and your innate psychology. Your innate psychology was caused by your genes and early development. Your genes were caused by your parents, and the causal chain extends back before your existence. And at no point in this chain did you create the causes. At no point did you originate the factors that shaped you. And so you are not the ultimate source of your actions. You are a link in a causal chain that extends beyond you. And if responsibility requires ultimate origination, then you are not responsible because you did not originate yourself, did not create the character from which your choices flow. The origination paradox can be stated as an impossibility argument. To be ultimately responsible for an action, you must be ultimately responsible for how you are, for your character, your values, your psychology, because your action flows from how you are, and to be ultimately responsible for how you are. You must have chosen to be that way, but to choose to be a certain way, you must already have some character, some values, some psychology to make the choice with, and this prior character must itself have been chosen if you are to be ultimately responsible for it. And this leads to an infinite regress. You must have chosen your character. Before choosing your character, must have existed before you existed to create yourself. And this is impossible. And so ultimate responsibility, ultimate origination is impossible. And if free will requires it, then free will is impossible. Visualize the regress to be responsible for action. A, you must be responsible for character C that caused A, and to be responsible for C, you must be responsible for earlier character CE that caused C, and to be responsible for C, you must be responsible for even earlier character C, and so on infinitely. And the regress cannot be completed, cannot be grounded, because there is no first character that you chose, no original act of self-creation. And so the chain of responsibility has no beginning, hangs unsupported, and ultimate responsibility collapses. And with it collapses free will understood as requiring ultimate origination. This argument, developed by Galen Strawson and others, is meant to show that libertarian free will understood as requiring ultimate sourcehood, is impossible, is incoherent. And this drives the debate toward compatibilism, toward the view that free will does not require ultimate origination, but only requires that actions flow from the agent's own psychology, from their desires and values, even if those desires and values were themselves caused by factors beyond the agent's control. And compatibilism avoids the origination paradox by weakening the requirements for freedom, by denying that ultimate origination is necessary. One response to the origination paradox accepts it, accepts that ultimate responsibility is impossible, and embraces the conclusion that no one is truly responsible in the ultimate sense. And this view, sometimes called hard incompatibilism, denies both that we have libertarian free will and that compatibilist freedom is sufficient for genuine responsibility. And moral responsibility is an illusion, is a concept that cannot be sustained once we recognize the impossibility of ultimate origination, and we should replace responsibility with other concepts, with forward-looking considerations about consequences and prevention rather than backward-looking considerations about desert and blame. Another response argues that ultimate origination is not necessary for responsibility, that responsibility requires only proximate origination, being the proximate cause of action, the immediate source. And as long as your action flows from your own deliberation, your own character, you are responsible, even if your character was shaped by prior causes, even if you are not the ultimate source. And proximate origination is sufficient for the kind of responsibility that matters for ethics and law. And the origination paradox shows only that ultimate responsibility is impossible, not that ordinary responsibility is impossible, and we should not let the impossible standard of ultimate origination undermine the possible standard of proximate origination. A third response from agent causation theories argues that persons are uncaused causes, are agents who can initiate causal chains without being caused to initiate them. And agent causation is a special kind of causation, different from event causation, where events cause events and agents, as substances have the power to cause events without being caused to exercise that power. And this avoids the regress because the agent does not need to cause themselves, does not need prior character to act, but can act directly as an uncaused cause. And this preserves ultimate origination by making agents first causes. But critics argue that agent causation is mysterious, unexplained, involves a kind of causation that seems inconsistent with naturalism, seems like magic, and the theory creates more problems than it solves. The origination paradox also connects to debates about moral luck, about whether we can be responsible for factors beyond our control, because the paradox shows that if we trace back far enough, everything is beyond our control, everything is luck, is the product of factors we did not choose, and if we cannot be responsible for luck, then we cannot be responsible for anything. And this conclusion, while following from the paradox, seems too extreme, seems to eliminate responsibility entirely. And this drives some philosophers to accept moral luck, to accept that we can be responsible for actions that depend on factors beyond our control. That responsibility does not require eliminating luck, but only requires certain kinds of control, certain kinds of connection between agent and action. The philosopher asks where you came from, how you became the person you are, and the answer traces back through causes, through genes and upbringing and choices and experiences. And none of these origins were ultimately under your control. None were self-created, and so you are not self-caused, are not self-created, are not the ultimate origination of yourself. And if responsibility requires self-creation, then you are not responsible, and the origination paradox stands as a permanent challenge to libertarian theories of free will, shows that ultimate origination is impossible, shows that we cannot be the uncaused first causes of ourselves, and whether this impossibility undermines all responsibility or only ultimate responsibility remains contested, and the paradox persists, a challenge to the idea that we are truly the authors of our actions, truly the originators of our choices, and the causal chain extends back, and you stand in the middle, caused by the past, causing the future, and where you came from. Who created you? The answer is no one. You emerged from causes, were shaped by forces, and the origination was not yours, was nature's, was the universe's, and whether this makes you unfree, makes responsibility impossible, remains one of the deepest questions in philosophy of free will, and the origination paradox endures, impossible to solve, impossible to escape, a permanent reminder that self-creation is impossible, and ultimate origination is a fantasy, and what we are left with is proximate origination, being the immediate cause of actions, being the link through which causes flow, and whether this is enough for freedom remains the central question, and the paradox stands stark and unavoidable, showing that we did not create ourselves, cannot create ourselves, and yet must live and choose and be responsible somehow. The paradox of fiction, why we cry for people who don't exist. A person sits in a dark theatre watching a film, and on the screen a character faces tragedy, loses a loved one, experiences betrayal, suffers deeply, and the person watching feels genuine emotion, feels sadness, feels tears forming, feels the physiological responses of grief, and yet the person knows that what is happening on screen is not real, knows that the characters are fictional, that no one actually died, that the suffering is pretend, is mere actors following a script in front of cameras. And this creates a puzzle because emotions seem to require beliefs, seem to depend on thinking that something is really happening, that genuine harm or loss has occurred, and if you do not believe something is real, then you should not have emotional responses to it. And yet, fiction produces powerful emotions. Despite the audience knowing It is fiction. And this is the paradox of fiction, articulated by Colin Radford and others. The question of how we can be moved by what we know to be false, how we can fear for characters we know do not exist, how we can grieve losses we know never happened. And the paradox challenges our understanding of emotion, raises questions about the relationship between belief and feeling, and forces recognition that emotional responses are more complex than simple belief response models suggest. Imagine watching a horror film, a scene where the protagonist is chased by a monster, and your heart races, adrenaline surges, you feel fear, genuine fear, and yet you know you are safe. Know you are sitting in a theatre, know that no monster exists, that the events on screen are fabricated, and if fear requires believing you are in danger, then you should not feel fear, should remain calm, should watch with detachment, but you do not. You respond emotionally, despite knowing the fiction is not real, and this emotional engagement is not a mistake, not a failure of rationality, but is how fiction works, how stories affect us. And the paradox asks how this is possible, how belief and emotion relate when they seem to come apart in cases of fiction. The paradox can be formulated as three inconsistent claims. First, we have emotional responses to fictional characters and events. We cry at sad movies, laugh at comedies, feel suspense in thrillers, and this is undeniable. Second, emotional responses require beliefs about the reality of their objects. You cannot fear something you know does not threaten you, cannot grieve something you know did not happen. Emotions are directed at states of affairs we believe obtain. And third, we do not believe fictional characters and events are real. We know they are fictional, know that no one is actually in danger, that no loss actually occurred. And these three claims are inconsistent. Any two imply the negation of the third, and resolving the paradox requires rejecting or modifying one of them. Visualize the emotional response as a two-stage process. First comes the perception or imagination of a situation, seeing the character in danger, imagining their suffering, and second comes the emotion, the fear or sadness or joy, and normally these two stages are connected through belief. You perceive danger and believe it is real, and this causes fear. But in fiction, the connection is different. You perceive or imagine danger, but do not believe it is real, and yet fear occurs anyway. And the paradox asks what mediates the connection in fiction, if not belief. One response denies the second claim, argues that emotions do not require beliefs, that emotional responses can be triggered by perceptions or imaginings without requiring that we believe what we perceive or imagine is real, and this response treats emotions as more primitive than beliefs, as responses that evolved to deal with immediate situations and that can be activated by representations even when we know those representations are not real. And fiction works by hijacking these emotional systems, by presenting stimuli that trigger emotional responses directly without requiring belief. And so we fear fictional monsters, because our fear system responds to the representation of danger even when we know the danger is fictional. Another response modifies the first claim, argues that the emotions we feel toward fiction are not genuine emotions, but quasi-emotions, pale imitations of real emotions that lack certain components. And when we cry at a movie, we are not really sad, not in the way we would be sad if the events were real, but we are experiencing something similar, a simulation or shadow of sadness. And this quasi-emotion does not require belief, because it is not the full genuine article, and this response preserves the connection between belief and genuine emotion while explaining fiction through a different kind of response that resembles emotion without being emotion. A third response, associated with Kendall Walton, appeals to imaginative engagement, argues that when we engage with fiction, we make believe. We imagine that the fictional events are real, and our emotional responses are responses to what we imagine rather than to what we believe. And imagination can trigger emotional responses without requiring belief. can produce fear and sadness and joy through imagined scenarios. And fiction invites us to imagine certain things, and our emotions follow from these imaginings. And this response treats make-believe as a distinct cognitive mode, different from both belief and mere perception. A mode that can generate emotions without requiring that we believe the imagined content is real. The paradox also raises questions about the function of fiction, about why we engage with fictional narratives, why we subject ourselves to emotions triggered by events we know are not real. And various answers have been proposed. Perhaps fiction allows us to explore possibilities, to experience situations vicariously, to rehearse emotional responses in safe contexts. Perhaps it serves social functions, helps us understand others, builds empathy, creates shared experiences, or perhaps it provides aesthetic pleasure, the enjoyment of well-crafted narratives, regardless of their truth. And understanding why fiction moves us might help explain how it moves us, might reveal the mechanisms that connect fictional representations to emotional responses. The paradox extends beyond fiction to other representational arts, to paintings that depict scenes that never occurred, to music that evokes emotions without representing anything, to imaginative scenarios we generate ourselves when daydreaming or planning. And in all these cases, emotions arise without corresponding beliefs about reality. And this suggests that the relationship between emotion and belief is more flexible than the paradox assumes, that emotions can be triggered in multiple ways, through beliefs about reality, but also through perceptions, imaginings, representations, and stimuli that engage our emotional systems directly. Some philosophers argue that the paradox reveals important truths about the nature of emotion, that emotions are not simply cognitive responses to believed states of affairs, but are complex phenomena involving perception, imagination, physiological arousal, and behavioral dispositions. And these components can dissociate, can come apart, and in fiction, we have the perceptual and imaginative components without the belief component, and this dissociation produces emotional responses that are real but not fully equivalent to emotions directed at reality. And so the paradox is not a problem to solve, but a feature to explain, a demonstration of the complexity of emotional life. The theatre darkens, the film plays, the character suffers, and the audience cries, knowing it is fiction, yet moved nonetheless. And the paradox remains a puzzle about how art affects us, how representation produces emotion, how we can care about what we know does not exist. And the tears are real, even though their object is not. And this strange combination, this ability to be moved by acknowledged fiction, is central to human experience, is what makes stories powerful, makes art meaningful, makes imagination a source of feeling as potent as reality. And the paradox endures, unresolved in the sense that no consensus solution has emerged. No account of emotion and fiction that satisfies all philosophers, only a recognition that fiction moves us, that we respond emotionally to representations, that imagination and emotion are deeply connected, and that the relationship between belief and feeling is more complex than we thought. And the paradox persists as a reminder that human psychology is subtle, that cognitive and emotional systems interact in non-obvious ways, and that the ability to be moved by fiction, far from being a problem or a mistake, is a capacity that enriches life, that allows us to experience more than our immediate circumstances, to feel for others, to explore possibilities, and to find meaning in stories we know are not true. The ontological paradox, why existence itself is impossible. A philosopher asks the most fundamental question in metaphysics, asks why anything exists at all, why there is something rather than nothing, and this question seems to demand an answer. Seems like there must be some explanation for the existence of the universe, some reason why being triumphs over non-being, and yet every proposed answer creates problems, creates paradoxes, leads to infinite regress or unjustified stopping points. And this is the ontological paradox, the puzzle about existence itself, about whether existence requires explanation, whether existence can be explained, whether there could be a sufficient reason for there being something rather than nothing. And the paradox arises because existence seems to be a brute fact, seems to be something that just is without explanation, and yet accepting brute facts seems unsatisfying, seems to violate the principle of sufficient reason, the principle that everything has an explanation. And this tension between the demand for explanation and the impossibility of ultimate explanation creates the ontological paradox, a paradox that has troubled philosophers since ancient times, that remains unresolved, that perhaps cannot be resolved, and that reveals deep limits on human understanding, on our capacity to explain why things are rather than why they are not. Imagine trying to explain why the universe exists, why there is something rather than nothing, and you might say the universe exists because it was created, but then you must explain why the creator exists. And if you say the creator exists necessarily, exists by its own nature, cannot fail to exist, then you face the question of why necessary existence is possible, why there are any necessary beings, why the category of necessary existence is not empty. And if you say the creator has no explanation, exists as a brute fact, then you have abandoned the demand for explanation, have accepted that existence requires no reason. And if existence requires no reason, then why not say the universe itself exists as a brute fact? Why invoke a creator at all? And the explanatory chain either goes on forever, infinite regress, or stops at something unexplained. Brute fact, and neither option is satisfying. Neither provides the ultimate explanation we were seeking. And the ontological paradox emerges, the recognition that existence cannot be fully explained, that the question why something, rather than nothing, has no satisfactory answer. The paradox can be stated as an impossibility argument. Either everything has an explanation, or some things are brute facts without explanation. If everything has an explanation, then there must be an explanation for the totality of all facts, for why anything exists at all. And this explanation must appeal to something outside the totality, something that explains why the totality exists. But nothing is outside the totality. The totality includes everything, and so there can be no explanation for the totality, and so not everything has an explanation. And there are brute facts, and if there are brute facts, then the principle of sufficient reason is false, and we must accept that some things exist without reason, without explanation. And if existence requires no explanation, then the question why something rather than nothing has no answer is not a real question, is based on the false assumption that existence requires explanation. Visualize nothingness, absolute nothingness, no matter, no energy, no space, no time, no laws of nature, no mathematical structures, no abstract objects, nothing at all. And from this nothingness, something emerges. The universe comes into being. And the question is why? What caused this emergence? What explained this transition from nothing to something? And the problem is that causes and explanations presuppose existence, presuppose that there are things that can cause and explain. And absolute nothingness contains no causes, no explanations, nothing that could produce something. And so the emergence from nothing seems impossible, seems to violate principles of causation and explanation. And yet here we are. Existence is actual. Something exists. And this existence seems inexplicable, seems to be a brute fact that cannot be explained in terms of anything more fundamental, because there is nothing more fundamental than existence itself. One response to the ontological paradox accepts it, accepts that existence is a brute fact, that there is no explanation for why there is something rather than nothing, that the universe just exists without reason. And this response abandons the principle of sufficient reason, abandons the demand that everything be explained, and treats existence as the foundation, as the starting point beyond which explanation cannot go. And this response is common among atheist philosophers, among those who see the universe as all there is, as existing without creator or external explanation. And the ontological paradox is dissolved by rejecting one of its premises, by denying that existence requires explanation. Another response appeals to necessary existence, argues that something must exist, that nothingness is not a genuine possibility, that existence is necessary, and the question why something rather than nothing is based on the false assumption that nothing is a real alternative. And various arguments have been offered for necessary existence, arguments that nothingness is unstable, that something must arise from nothing due to quantum fluctuations or logical necessity, or arguments that necessary beings like God exist by their nature and cannot fail to exist. And these arguments attempt to show that existence is not contingent, not dependent on external factors, but is necessary, is unavoidable. And if existence is necessary, then the question why something rather than nothing dissolves. The answer is that something must exist. Nothing is not an option. A third response questions the question, argues that why is there something rather than nothing is not a genuine question, is based on confusion about what questions can meaningfully be asked. And the question presupposes that nothing is the default, the expected state, and something is the deviation that requires explanation. But this presupposition is unjustified. There is no reason to privilege nothing over something, no reason to think nothing is more natural or more likely. And if something and nothing are on equal footing, then the question collapses, becomes unanswerable because it has no presupposition to support it. And the ontological paradox dissolves because the founding question is revealed to be pseudo-question. The ontological paradox also connects to debates about cosmology, about the origin of the universe, about whether the Big Bang was the beginning of everything, or whether something existed before, and cosmologists have proposed various scenarios. Eternal inflation, where universes are constantly being created in a multiverse. Cyclic cosmologies, where the universe goes through endless cycles of expansion and contraction. Quantum creation, where the universe emerged from quantum vacuum fluctuations, and each scenario pushes the question back, explains our universe in terms of something more fundamental. But the question remains why that more fundamental thing exists, why there is quantum vacuum, why there are laws of physics, why there is anything at all. And the ontological paradox persists at every level, cannot be escaped by postulating more fundamental entities or processes. Some philosophers embrace the paradox, treat it as revealing something deep about the limits of explanation, about the structure of understanding. That explanation must stop somewhere, must reach a foundation that is itself unexplained. And existence is that foundation, is the basic fact that grounds all other facts. And accepting this involves accepting that not everything can be explained, that the demand for total explanation is impossible to satisfy, and the ontological paradox is not a problem to solve, but a limit to accept, a recognition that human understanding has boundaries, that some questions have no answers, and the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is such a question, is beyond our capacity to answer. And we must live with the mystery, with the brute fact of existence. The universe exists, spreads across billions of light years, contains galaxies and stars and planets and life. And the question echoes, why? Why does any of this exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? And no answer fully satisfies, no explanation reaches the ultimate ground. And the ontological paradox persists, ancient and insoluble. A paradox that reveals the limits of metaphysics, the boundaries of explanation, the point where philosophy must fall silent and accept that existence simply is, without reason, without cause, without ultimate explanation. And the paradox endures as one of the deepest problems in philosophy, a problem that perhaps cannot be solved because it points to the edge of what can be understood, the limit where explanation gives out and brute fact takes over, and existence remains, mysterious and fundamental, and the question remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable.